They laughed when Claire bought the rusted farmhouse. Mark mocked her for chasing what he called her ruin. But the moment she unlocked a hidden trapdoor, everything changed. Beneath the creaking floors lay tunnels, brick passages, and a secret chamber untouched for a century, filled with smuggled bottles, weapons, and letters that revealed her great-grandfather's forbidden past. What started as ridicule became a journey through hidden history, danger, and discovery. Could one woman's vision uncover secrets 100 years old? Join us as the Farmhouse's forgotten tunnels tell a story no one expected, and reveal a legacy that refuses to stay buried. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The courthouse was colder than Claire expected. Its walls painted a shade of gray that made every sound seem sharper. The clerk pushed the final papers across the counter, her pen already waiting. Claire hesitated only for a breath before signing her name in careful strokes. Beside her, Mark leaned back in his chair with arms crossed. His smirk meant less for her and more for the small audience of friends and relatives who had insisted on coming along. To them, it was a show, a woman throwing away money on what they called a rusted skeleton in a house in the middle of nowhere. Her brother whispered something to her sister-in-law, and both laughed. Mark caught it, chuckled himself, and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least it'll make a good set for a horror movie." The word stung, though Claire didn't show it. She had spent months driving down dirt roads and sifting through listings that most buyers wouldn't glance at twice. The farmhouse had stood out to her not for what it was, but for what it might become. The photographs showed peeling paint, a roof line sagging under years of neglect, and fields that had long surrendered to weeds. But she saw angles others missed. The way the light cut across the land in late afternoon, the old barn beam still steady under the dust, the soil dark with potential. Where others saw ruin, she saw a possibility. Mark hadn't stopped mocking her since she first mentioned it. To him, it was wasted money, a reckless whim disguised as vision. He preferred their small rental in town, predictable and ordinary. He had grown up hearing that old farms were nothing but burdens, endless repairs and bills that swallowed families whole. Yet he came along anyway, if only to shake his head at the sight of his wife, making what he told everyone would be the mistake of her life. As Claire handed the pen back to the clerk, the whispers and snickers grew. Her cousin leaned forward with an exaggerated grin and said, "You'll need more than paint to fix that dump. Better hope the roof doesn't collapse before you move in." Someone else added, "If the rats don't chase you out first." Even Mark joined the laughter, shaking his head as if her signature was proof of madness. Claire gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and slipped them into her bag. She said nothing. Years of living with Mark's sarcasm had taught her silence was often the stronger reply. But inside, her resolve hardened. The farmhouse was hers now, in all its rust and ruin. Whether it crumbled or stood again, it would do so under her care, not under the judgment of those who couldn't see past broken boards and rusted hinges. Outside, the autumn air bit with the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. The group lingered on the courthouse steps, still trading jokes at her expense. Mark lit a cigarette and gestured with it, like a conductor encouraging their laughter. Claire walked ahead, her bag tucked tight under her arm, her eyes fixed not on them but on the horizon where the farmhouse waited. She knew it looked like failure to them, but she felt something else stirring beneath the ridicule. Something quiet, steady, and immovable. When Mark caught up, he flicked ash onto the pavement and said, "Well, you've done it. Bought yourself a pile of trouble. Don't say I didn't warn you." Claire only smiled faintly, her mind already shifting to the long dirt driveway, the creaking porch, and the keys that would soon be heavy in her pocket. Whatever waited in that farmhouse, it was hers to uncover. The mockery would follow her for weeks, but so would the pull of the land, and that was a weight she welcomed. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the gravel drive, and for a moment neither Claire nor Mark spoke. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its once white siding now mottled with rust-colored streaks where rain had traced paths over decades of neglect. The porch sagged at one corner, its railings leaning outward like tired arms. Windows were clouded with dirt, some cracked, others patched with cardboard long since softened by storms. The roof was a quilt of broken tiles and warped metal sheets, sections curling up as if the house itself were trying to shrug off the years. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the whisper of tall weeds shifting in the autumn wind. Mark let out a low whistle that wasn't admiration. "Well," he said, leaning forward against the steering wheel, "I've seen barns that looked better before they were set on fire." His tone was sharp with ridicule, the same edge he had carried since the day she signed the papers. Claire said nothing. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers tracing circles she didn't realize she was making. She had braced herself for this moment, yet the sight still stole her breath. The yard was worse than she remembered. Weeds stood waist-high in places, tipped with brittle seed heads that rattled against one another. Old fence posts leaned at precarious angles, their wire rusted through and dangling loose like broken stitches. What had once been a small orchard showed only gnarled silhouettes, branches reaching skyward in desperate shapes. The field stretched beyond, wide patches of brown and green that had surrendered long ago to thistle and thorn. A tractor's rusting skeleton leaned against a shed, its wheels half swallowed by the earth. Mark finally stepped out of the car, kicking at the gravel as he surveyed the scene. "This is it? This is your dream." He laughed, short and sharp, before gesturing toward the porch. "I wouldn't trust that thing to hold a raccoon, let alone us." Claire followed slowly, her eyes climbing the farmhouse's face. Up close, she saw how the wood siding had warped and split, curling at the edges like peeling bark. Nails had risen from the boards, their rust bleeding into the grain. The smell of dampness clung to everything, mixed with the faint sourness of mold. She pressed her hand against the doorframe, feeling the roughness and neglected wood beneath her palm. She could hear Mark behind her, muttering to himself about money wasted, about the mountain of repairs waiting to swallow them whole. Each word pricked at her, but she let them pass. Instead, she imagined the board smooth and painted again, the roof patched and shining in the sun, the fields cut clean and green with new growth. It was all still here, buried under years of abandonment, waiting for someone patient enough to see past the rot. The wind swept across the porch, carrying with it the creak of old hinges and the faint rattle of something loose in the eaves. Claire turned the key in her pocket, feeling its weight. To everyone else, this was a ruin, rotted wood, broken tiles, fields left to weeds. But to her, it was the first breath of something not yet reborn. She reached for the door, steady despite the laughter that lingered at her back. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned but did not break. Dust poured from the darkness like a breath released after years of silence. Claire stepped over the threshold first, her boots pressing against warped floorboards that gave slightly under her weight. She froze, waiting to see if they would hold, and when they did, she allowed herself a small smile. The smell of mildew and old would fill the space, sharp and earthy, the scent of a place long forgotten. Mark followed behind, his footsteps loud with impatience. He swept his arm across the dim room, pointing out everything at once. The water stain spidering across the ceiling, the wallpaper peeling in wide strips, the holes chewed through baseboards. "This is it," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "This is the palace you've been talking about? Claire, this isn't a home. It's a graveyard for houses." She ignored him for the moment, moving slowly across the room. The light from the doorway caught the edge of a stone fireplace that stretched from floor to ceiling, its mantel still carved with delicate details despite layers of soot. Claire brushed her fingers across it, leaving streaks where dust had collected, and pictured logs stacked neatly inside, flames chasing shadows across the walls. She saw the board sanded and polished, the windows cleared to let morning light spill through. Her voice was quiet when she finally answered him. "I see more than rot, Mark. I see what it could be." He barked a laugh, harsh and sudden. What it could be, that's the problem. You're chasing a picture in your head while standing in a dump. Do you know how much it costs to replace a roof like that? Or rip out floors like these? We don't have that kind of money. Claire, we barely scrape by as it is. She turned to face him then, meeting the frustration in his eyes with her calm steadiness. "You see costs. I see potential. You see broken boards. I see the beams that still hold steady after all these years. This house hasn't collapsed, not after decades of neglect. That means something." Her hand pressed flat against the wall, and she felt its stubborn solidity beneath the surface. Mark shook his head, pacing now, kicking at the edges of the rug that had rotted through. It means we're trapped in your fantasy. You think a coat of paint and some sanding will erase all this? You'll drag us under with this dream of yours. People laugh for a reason, Claire. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her voice did not falter. Let them laugh. Let even you laugh. They can't see what I see, and maybe you won't until it's done. But I didn't sign those papers for them. I didn't sign them for you either. I signed them because this place called to me, because something here is worth saving. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the drip of water somewhere deep within the house. Mark looked around again, his mouth opening as if to continue, then closing when he found no new words. Claire stood in the middle of the ruined room, the dust swirling around her, her shoulders squared against ridicule. Dream and reality clashed between them, but she had already chosen her side. The first night in the farmhouse settled around them with an uneasy quiet. They had brought only a mattress, a pair of blankets, and a few boxes of food and tools, deciding it wasn't worth unpacking much until they decided where to begin. The rooms upstairs were too drafty, the windows too loose in their frames. So they camped in the living room, where the old fireplace still gave off the smell of wood long burned. Mark complained about the chill seeping through the walls, but Claire wrapped herself in a blanket and stared into the dim outlines of the house, as if she were memorizing it. The lantern's glow caught the dust that hung in the air, and every creak from the rafters above sounded like footsteps. Mark lay back with one arm under his head, muttering about how much work it would take to make the place livable. Claire didn't answer. Her attention had drifted to a strange seam in the floorboards near the far wall. The lines were too neat to be random. She stood and crossed the room, crouching down to run her fingers across the wood. The boards didn't quite match, as if they had been cut and fitted differently from the rest. Mark groaned when he saw her examining the floor. Don't tell me you've already found another project. It's the first night, Claire. Can't you just leave the ghost alone until morning? There's something here, she whispered, tracing the edge where the boards met. She pulled the lantern closer, and the light revealed the outline of a square hatch, its corners joined by rusted hinges that had nearly blended into the wood. She tugged at the edge, but it wouldn't budge. Her fingers came away with flakes of iron, and when she leaned closer, she saw the reason. Heavy chains crisscrossed the trapdoor, bolted into the wood with thick nails, their rust dark and thick from decades of moisture. Mark sat up, his tone caught somewhere between amusement and annoyance. Of course there's a trapdoor. Why wouldn't there be? Probably leads to a hole full of rats. Or worse. I told you, this house is nothing but trouble. Claire kept staring at it, her mind turning over questions. Why would anyone go to such lengths to seal a simple cellar? Chains this thick weren't meant for storage. They were meant to keep something closed. She imagined the effort it must have taken. The pounding of nails, the clatter of chains tightened over the boards, the decision to lock away whatever lay beneath. She pressed the sole of her boot against one of the chains, testing its strength. The links groaned but held fast. Mark shook his head and lay back down. Don't even think about it. We don't need to be crawling under this place. The roof's bad enough, and the plumbing's worse. Let the floor stay shut. Claire sat back on her heels, lantern in her lap, and kept her eyes on the sealed trapdoor long after Mark drifted to sleep. The farmhouse was full of broken wood and rusted nails, but this was different. This had been deliberate. The chains whispered of a history deeper than peeling wallpaper and sagging beams, something the laughter her family had never imagined. She didn't know what waited beneath, but she knew it was part why the house had pulled her in. The first night closed around her, the silence heavy, and she promised herself she would return to that door. Whatever it was hiding, it belonged to her now too. Morning broke thin and pale over the farmhouse, light slipping through cracks in the shutters and scattering across the dust in the air. Claire had barely slept, her thoughts circling back to the chained trapdoor in the living room. Mark, restless and irritated, insisted on driving into town for breakfast rather than face another cold cup of instant coffee. She didn't argue. She wanted to see the people who had grown up in the shadow of this house, the ones who had let it rot without touching it. The diner sat at the corner of Main Street, its windows fogged with steam and the smell of frying bacon clinging to the glass. Inside, conversations dipped for a moment when they walked through the door. Claire noticed it, the way eyes flicked to her and Mark before returning quickly to plates and cups. They slid into a booth. The vinyl cracked from years of use. A waitress brought coffee without asking, setting the cups down with a glance that lingered just a second too long. Mark was quick to fill the silence. He told anyone within earshot that they had bought the old farmhouse out on Miller's Road, laughing as though it were a punchline. "She dragged me out there," he said to the waitress, jerking his thumb at Claire. "Can you believe it? Place looks like it should be condemned. Roofs caving in, fields are a jungle. Might as well have bought a haunted house." The waitress didn't laugh. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and poured more coffee before moving on. Claire noticed the way her eyes shifted toward a man at the counter, older, with hands scarred from farm work. He caught the glance and lowered his head, stirring his coffee slowly. When their food came, Mark kept talking, spinning the story for anyone willing to listen. The locals gave polite smiles, but their eyes told a different story. When Claire tried to ask about the farmhouse, about who had lived there before, the conversations thinned. One man muttered something about bad luck and busied himself with his eggs. Another excused himself altogether, leaving bills on the counter and slipping out the door without finishing his coffee. After they left the diner, Claire stopped at the hardware store to pick up supplies. The owner, a tall man with graying hair, recognized the address on her order form. He hesitated before ringing it up. "That place," he said quietly, "has a history." When she pressed him, he only shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about, ma'am. Just don't go digging too deep." Back at the car, Mark chuckled, tossing a bag of nails onto the seat. "See? Even they think you're crazy. Whole town probably bets on how long before we give up and sell." But Claire wasn't laughing. The unease she had felt the night before deepened. These weren't the laughs of people who thought the house was just a wreck. This was something heavier, an old silence people carried rather than speak aloud. Whatever the farmhouse had been, its story still clung to the town, and no one wanted to be the one to tell it. The farmhouse creaked around them, as if it were listening. Every gust of wind rattled the loose shingles. Every step across the floorboards gave a hollow groan. Claire stood in the kitchen with a broom in her hands, sweeping piles of plaster dust into the corner. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, her hair tied back, her face flushed with the stubborn rhythm of work. Mark sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since cooled, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "You can't sweep away rot, Claire," he muttered finally, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't a fairy tale. You're not going to wave that broom and make this place turn into a home." She paused only for a second, the broom bristles pressing into the cracked linoleum. "It's not about sweeping it clean in one day. It's about starting, about not giving up before you've even tried." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Tried? We've been here 2 days, and I already know it's a mistake. The roof alone will cost more than what's left in our savings. The plumbing, God knows what shape it's in. And that thing in the living room, that chain door, you really want to mess with something people went out of their way to lock up." Claire's jaw tightened. She set the broom aside and faced him fully. "Yes, I do, because it's ours now. Everything in this house, even the parts we don't understand. I didn't sign those papers to walk away when it got hard." Her calm only fueled his frustration. He pushed back on the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "You didn't sign those papers for me, either. You dragged me into this because you had some vision you couldn't explain. Now we're both stuck in a rotting shack, while everyone in town gets a good laugh at our expense." Silence spread between them, heavier than the dust in the air. Claire's eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, then rose again, steady and unflinching. "Maybe you don't see it yet, but I do. I see what it can be, and I'd rather fight for that than live the rest of my life wishing I'd tried." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. He grabbed his jacket from the chair, muttering under his breath as he stepped outside, letting the screen door slam behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving Claire alone with her broom in the silence he left behind. She leaned against the counter, her chest tight, but she refused to let the weight of his words settle too deep. The wind pressed against the farmhouse walls, carrying with it the faint smell of wet earth and with smoke from the town below. Claire listened to the groan of the old beams above her head, the whispers of a house that had been mocked and abandoned long before she arrived. She understood its silence, its scars, its stubborn survival. She picked the broom back up, set her shoulders, and began sweeping again. The barn stood at the far edge of the property. Its red paint faded to a dull rust that blended with the weeds climbing its walls. The hinges screeched when Claire pulled the doors open, a sound that startled a pair of birds into flight. Dust swirled in the sudden light, and for a moment she only stood there, taking in the cavernous space. The roof sagged in places, shafts of daylight piercing through gaps in the shingles. Old tools lay scattered across the dirt floor, rusted saws, broken rakes, the skeleton of a wheelbarrow with no wheel. It was the kind of ruin Mark had pointed to again and again as proof she had lost her mind. Yet Claire felt drawn to it. The way the air inside seemed heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of more than dust and silence. Mark trailed behind, his boots crunching on the gravel before he stepped inside. "Looks like a death trap to me," he said, pushing a rotting ladder with the toe of his shoe until it collapsed in a puff of dust. "What do you think you're going to find here? Buried treasure?" His laughter echoed off the rafters, thin and hollow. Claire ignored him. She walked slowly along the walls, running her fingers across the beams. The wood was rough, scarred with age, but in the far corner something caught her eye. On one of the thick support posts, beneath a layer of grime, lines had been scratched into the surface. At first they looked like the usual marks of wear, nicks from tools, scrapes from years of use. But when she leaned closer, lantern light brushing across the grain, she saw patterns. Deliberate ones. "Mark!" she called softly, though he was already heading back toward the door. He sighed, turning halfway. "What now?" "Here, look at this." He came over reluctantly, squinting at the post. "So?" "Some kid probably carved initials in it 50 years ago." Claire shook her head. The marks weren't letters. They were shapes, interlocking triangles, circles with small lines radiating outward, symbols that didn't match the idle scratches of boredom. She traced one with her fingertip, feeling the shallow groove. "This wasn't random," she said. "Someone meant something by this." Mark gave a short laugh. "Or maybe someone had a pocket knife and too much time. Don't start building legends out of splinters." But Claire couldn't let it go. The more she studied the symbols, the more she saw order in them. They repeated with slight variations, as if following a code. In the corner above the marks, she noticed something else. Faint scorch lines, as though a lantern had been held there too long, or perhaps a torch rested against the beam. The combination of scratches and burns whispered of secrecy, of someone using this place for more than farm work. She stepped back, imagining the barn filled not with dust and silence, but with men huddled in shadows, tools in hand, whispering plans. The idea sent a chill up her spine. Mark shook his head and turned away, muttering about wasted time. But Claire stayed with the beam, her hand pressed flat against the carved symbols. For the first time since she had set foot on the property, she felt she wasn't just chasing a dream. The house and the barn were keeping secrets. And the first sign had just revealed itself. The farmhouse seemed quieter than usual that afternoon, the kind of stillness that pressed against the ears. Claire had been pacing the upstairs hallway, measuring steps against the creak of boards that had endured too many winters. She carried a notebook, sketching ideas for repairs, where walls might be reinforced, where new windows could one day be cut. Mark followed reluctantly, muttering warnings every time her foot lingered too close to a sagging plank. "Don't push your luck," he said, his voice sharp. "One wrong step, and you'll drop right through." She brushed him off, as she always did. If the house were ready to collapse, it already would have. Her words were meant to reassure, but as she leaned her weight forward, the board beneath her heel gave a sound that was more than a creak. It cracked with a sharpness that echoed through the hall. Mark lunged to grab her arm, but the wood split beneath her before he reached her. Claire dropped, her notebook flying from her hand, and for a moment there was only the jolt of falling and the crash of splintering timber. She landed hard, dust bursting around her in choking clouds, but the impact was not as deep as she feared. Pain shot through her knees, but when she pushed herself up, she realized she had fallen only a few feet. Mark's voice came from above, tense with both fear and frustration. "Claire, are you hurt?" She coughed, waving away the dust, her eyes adjusting to the dim space around her. "I'm fine," she called back, "but you need to see this." What surrounded her was no ordinary crawl space. The ground beneath the broken boards was not dirt as expected, but stone, carefully cut, fitted blocks forming a foundation that looked older than the farmhouse itself. The walls of stone stretched farther than she could see in the lantern light. Each block bore the marks of chisels, smooth on the edges, deliberate in their placement. This wasn't the rough stonework of farmers building a basement. It was something constructed with purpose. Mark lowered himself through the gap with a grunt, his boots scraping against the remains of the floor. He held the lantern high, its glow spilling across the chamber. His usual cynicism faltered as he took in the sight. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "These stones, they're older than the house. A lot older." Claire ran her fingers along one block, feeling the coldness of the stone, the faint impressions etched into the surface. Some resembled tool marks, but others hinted at patterns, almost symbols worn faint by time. The air down here was different too, cooler, with a faint draft that seemed to come from deeper still. Mark shook his head, though his voice carried less mockery than before. "Maybe it's just an old foundation, left from some other building." But Claire didn't believe that. She could feel it. The age, the intent, the way the stone seemed to hum with history. She looked back up to the hole in the floor, the farmhouse leaning above them like a mask stretched over something far older. For the first time, Mark had no easy joke to throw. The house had revealed a piece of itself, and neither of them could laugh it away. The attic was hotter than the rest of the farmhouse, the air trapped beneath the sagging roof heavy with dust and stale heat. Claire had climbed the narrow staircase alone, her lantern held high, its glow cutting through cobwebs that stretched like curtains across the rafters. Each step had protested beneath her, but she pressed on, ignoring the faint echo of Mark downstairs calling it a waste of time. The attic had been shut tight for years, perhaps decades, its single window clouded with grime, the glass fractured in a spider's web of cracks. She moved carefully, her boots sinking into drifts of dust and insulation that crumbled underfoot. Trunks sat in a crooked line against one wall, their leather cracked, their brass locks green with corrosion. She opened a few, finding nothing but moth-eaten fabric and yellowed papers too fragile to unfold. Still, something about the space kept her searching, as though the house itself had drawn her upward. She paused, tilting the lantern toward the beams overhead. The rafters were thick, old pine darkened with age, and in the gap between two of them she caught the faintest glimpse of something cylindrical wedged against the wood. Balancing on a stack of boxes, she reached up, her fingertips brushing against the edge. Dust rained down into her eyes, forcing her to blink, but she persisted, pulling until at last the object came free. It was a roll of parchment, its surface brittle but intact, tied with twine that had nearly disintegrated. She climbed down carefully, her breath quickening as she placed it on the nearest trunk. When she untied the cord, the parchment resisted, the edges clinging as though fused by time. With patient fingers, she eased it open, spreading across the lid of the trunk beneath the lantern's glow. What emerged was not a simple document. Faded ink lines stretched across the page in deliberate strokes. She recognized the outline of the farmhouse at the center, drawn with care. Surrounding it were fields, barns, and fences. But what caught her attention were the lines beneath, narrow, twisting paths marked under the house itself. Her pulse quickened. These weren't just floor plans. They were tunnels or chambers, traced with precision. Some led to the barn. Others disappeared into the land beyond, and several intersected directly beneath the main house. Small notations accompanied the drawings, symbols she did not recognize, but they repeated often enough to suggest meaning. Circles with slashes, triangles, crosses at junctions. She leaned closer, trying to decipher them. When the floorboards creaked behind her, Mark had followed after all, his expression sour as he ducked into the attic. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, brushing dust from his shoulders. "What now?" Claire lifted the parchment carefully so he could see. "It's a map," she whispered, "of this place. But look, there are lines beneath the house. Look at the way they branch." Mark studied it with narrowed eyes, then shook his head. "Probably some old plans that never got built. You're reading into it." But Claire felt the certainty rising in her chest. She traced the lines again, her finger pausing at the intersection marked by a bold cross beneath the living room, right where the chain trapdoor lay sealed. She looked up at Mark, her voice steady despite the dust thick in her throat. "No," she said, "this isn't chance. Someone left this here for a reason." The attic seemed to tighten around them, the house holding its breath as they bent over the parchment. Outside, the wind rattled the cracked window pane, but Claire hardly noticed. The farmhouse had given her another sign, one too clear for even Mark's cynicism to erase. The map wasn't just history. It was a direction, a promise, and perhaps a warning. The lantern flickered low that evening, its flame throwing long shadows against the living room walls. Claire had spread the parchment across the table, weighing its corners with chipped mugs to keep it from curling back into itself. She leaned over it, tracing the faint lines with her fingertip, whispering half-formed thoughts as she pieced together the map's meaning. Beneath her hand, the tunnels wound like veins under the farmhouse, connecting rooms, vanishing into earth, intersecting in ways that made no sense for a simple farm cellar. The chain trapdoor sat at the very heart of it all, marked by a cross bold enough that even after decades of fading, it stood out clearly. Mark paced the room with heavy steps, his voice sharp enough to cut through her concentration. "You're really going to tell me this is real? That some secret labyrinth lies under our feet? Claire, it's nonsense. Some farmer probably doodled plans for irrigation, or maybe he was drunk and liked drawing lines. You're chasing ghosts and dust." Claire didn't look up. "These are not doodles. Look how precise they are. The lines measure against the house perfectly. Whoever drew this knew exactly what they were marking." He laughed, bitter and short, as he stopped at the window to light another cigarette. The match flared briefly, illuminating his skeptical expression before it faded into smoke. "And what then? Suppose it is a tunnel. You think there's some treasure waiting? A pot of gold and the floorboards? All I see is rot, expense, and now you want to dig holes in the ground to find more trouble." Her eyes lifted at that, catching his silhouette against the glass. "It's not about treasure. It's about the house. Don't you feel it? Every part of this place has been hiding something, waiting. The symbols in the barn, the foundation we fell into, now this map. It's connected." Mark exhaled slowly, smoke drifting in front of his face. "Connected to what? Old drunks, bad builders, and your imagination? You want to believe this place chose you, but it didn't. You chose it, and now you're trying to justify the mistake by spinning stories." The word stung, but Claire steadied herself. She folded her hands on the parchment, her voice quiet but firm. "I chose it because I felt something here. And every day we uncover more that proves I was right. You can mock it, but I won't turn away. Not when it feels like we're standing on the edge of something important." The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the lantern as it burned lower. Mark finally stubbed his cigarette out on the sill, his shoulders sagging as if he had run out of energy to fight. He muttered, almost to himself, "Important things don't come from rotten wood and broken fields." Claire looked back down at the map, the cross beneath the trapdoor glowing faintly in the lantern's light, and whispered so softly he might not have heard. "Sometimes they do." The room settled into uneasy quiet, the weight of their argument lingering in the shadows. Upstairs, the old beams groaned, and beneath their feet the house seemed to breathe, as though it were listening. Rain came first as a whisper against the windows, light taps on the glass that barely stirred the air inside the farmhouse. But as evening deepened, the whisper grew into a steady drumbeat. The roof, with its broken tiles and warped timbers, caught the downpour in uneven rhythms, dripping into buckets Claire had placed earlier in the day. Mark muttered each time a drop struck metal, counting them as proof of her mistake. Claire sat near the fire, lantern at her side, staring at the map they had left unrolled on the table. Outside, the storm thickened until the world beyond the windows blurred into sheets of water. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the buckets filled too quickly. Claire rose to empty it, her feet slipping slightly on the damp floorboards. She followed the sound of dripping water, her lantern light brushing across the walls. That was when she noticed a thin line of moisture trailing along the baseboard, not from above, but from below. She knelt, touched it, and pulled her hand back. Cold water seeped upward through the cracks, flowing as though the house itself were breathing it in. "Mark," she called, her voice carrying a sharpness that caught his attention. He rose reluctantly, cigarette in hand, and joined her at the wall. "See this? The water isn't coming from the roof. It's being pulled down." He frowned, crouching to run his own hand along the seam. "It's an old house, Claire. Everything leaks. Not like this." She stood, grabbed a lantern, and walked toward the cellar door they had managed to unchain earlier in the day. The hinges groaned when she pulled it open, releasing a breath of damp, cold air. She descended carefully, each step slick beneath her boots, Mark following with a muttered curse. The cellar was darker than usual, the lantern's glow swallowed by shadows that seemed to press closer with every flicker. The stone walls gleamed with wetness, streams of rainwater sliding down in narrow rivulets. Claire held the lantern higher, and they both watched as the water didn't pool on the ground like it should have. Instead, it threaded into cracks between the stones, vanishing as though the walls themselves were drinking it. Mark swore under his breath. "That's not right." She stepped closer, tracing one of the streams with her eyes. It disappeared into a gap wide enough for her to press a finger against, the stone around it smooth as though water had been flowing there for years. She turned slowly, sweeping the lantern around the cellar. The pattern repeated across the walls. Lines of water, always pulled inward, never outward. It was deliberate, too precise to be chance. "It's draining somewhere," Claire whispered, her voice swallowed by the hiss of rain overhead. Mark didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the cracks, the realization settling into him despite his cynicism. Finally, he shook his head. "If it's going somewhere, I don't want to know where. This house already has too many secrets." But Claire did want to know. She held the lantern close to the wall, watching the last of the rainwater slip into stone like ink disappearing into paper. The storm raged above, but down here the house seemed calm, as if it had been waiting for this moment to show them what lay beneath. For the first time, Mark's silence was heavier than his ridicule, and Claire knew he felt it too. The cellar was more than a foundation. It was an opening. The storm lingered into the following day, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in damp silence. Puddles dotted the yard, and the air inside carried the sharp scent of wet wood. Claire moved from room to room with restless steps, her thoughts circling back again and again to the trapdoor in the living room. The chain still lay across it, heavy with rust, stubbornly holding shut what the map and the storm had already hinted at. Each time she passed, she felt its weight pulling at her. Mark sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper he'd picked up in town, though he barely read it. He noticed the way she lingered near the door, the way her eyes traced the rusted links. "Don't," he said flatly, not even looking up. "We've got enough problems without you tearing open something people went out of their way to keep closed." Claire knelt beside it, running her hand across the cold iron. "That's just it," she said quietly. "Someone didn't just nail it shut. They chained it. Why? What could be so important or dangerous that it needed this?" Mark folded the paper, his patience thinning. Maybe it was dangerous for a reason. Maybe there's rot down there, or snakes, or who knows what else. You open it and we'll have more repairs, more bills, more of everything we can't afford. She met his eyes, her voice steady. Or maybe it's the answer to why this place feels the way it does. He laughed, but it lacked conviction. Feels the way it does? Claire, it feels like a wreck. That's all. But she had already fetched the bolt cutters from the barn. Their jaws were pitted with rust, but they still carried enough strength to bite. She positioned them over the first chain link, her hands firm despite the tremor in her chest. Mark stood, chair scraping against the floor, his voice rising. "Don't do it. I'm serious. Once you open it, you can't close it again." Claire pressed down. The cutters groaned, the chain resisted, and for a moment it seemed like nothing would give. Then, with a sharp snap, the link broke, the sound echoing to the farmhouse like a shot. She moved to the next, ignoring Mark's curses behind her. Each snap rang louder, until the final length of chain clattered across the boards. For a moment, silence followed. Even the wind outside seemed to hold back. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the iron ring of the trapdoor. Mark stood frozen a few feet away, torn between anger and fear. She pulled and would lift it with a long groan, dust rising in a thick cloud. The dark mouth of the cellar yawned open, air rising from below damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of stone and earth. Mark swore again, softer this time, his voice uncertain. "You've done it now." Claire lowered the lantern into the opening. Its light stretched downward, catching the edges of stone steps carved rough but deliberate. They descended into shadow, deeper than any simple cellar should have gone. She felt her pulse quicken, her fear folding into determination. The chains had tried to keep this hidden, but now it was hers to see. Behind her, Mark muttered, almost pleading, "Leave it, Claire. Just leave it." But she didn't. She kept the lantern steady, staring into the dark below, knowing the house had finally given her a path it had waited years for someone to open. The lantern's glow swayed over the opening, spilling light down the narrow steps that cut into the earth. Claire stood at the edge of the trapdoor, the broken chain scattered around her feet, and felt a draft rise up to meet her. It was not the damp stillness of an ordinary basement, but a steady breath of cold air, sharp and dry, as if the earth below had been holding its lungs for years and finally exhaled. The chill raised a hair on her arms despite the heaviness of the humid storm still clinging to the farmhouse above. Mark lingered back, his arms folded, his face pale in the lantern light. "That's not normal," he muttered. "Air doesn't move like that underground, not unless there's more down there than we want to know." Claire lowered herself onto the first step, gripping the railing that was little more than a splintered beam nailed to the wall. The stone beneath her boots was worn smooth, edges softened by countless feet long since gone. She paused, breathing in the scent carried upward, a mixture of cold stone, rust, and something faintly metallic that she couldn't name. "It's not just a cellar," she said softly, as though afraid to break the quiet. "Someone built this to last." Mark's voice was sharp in reply. "Or someone built it for reasons we should respect. Things get sealed for a reason, Claire. You think maybe all those chains weren't warning enough." But Claire kept ascending. The lantern cast shadows that clung to the walls, revealing carved stones fitted together with care, unlike the rough foundation she expected. As she reached the bottom, the air grew colder still, a steady draft brushing her face. She lifted the lantern high and saw the passage stretching beyond the stairs, its ceiling low, its walls glistening faintly with condensation. The draft came from there, rushing past her as though pulled from depths unknown. Mark had finally followed, each step down loud with reluctance. When his boots touched the stone floor, he stood still, eyes darting along the corridor. "This is insane," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "There shouldn't be anything down here." Claire moved forward, her hands sliding along the wall. She felt grooves under her fingers, not random scratches, but deliberate cuts, marks that echoed the strange symbols she had traced in the barn. The same triangles, the same circles, shallow but unmistakable. They lined the stones like a silent record of those who had once passed through. The draft picked up suddenly, strong enough to flicker the lantern flame and send shadows spinning. It carried with it a faint, hollow sound, as if air were rushing through chambers far beyond their reach. Claire turned toward it, eyes bright despite the cold biting at her skin. "There's more," she whispered. Mark shook his head, taking a step back toward the stairs. "No, there's too much. Whatever's down here, it's been buried for a reason, and we should have left it that way." But Claire couldn't. The house had kept its secrets buried long enough. The cold air rising from the darkness was not just warning, it was invitation. She tightened her grip on the lantern and stepped deeper into the unknown. The lantern flame trembled as Claire moved forward, its circle of light pushing against the dark, but never quite holding it back. Each step echoed softly, the stone floor beneath her boots smoother than it had any right to be in a simple farmhouse cellar. She trailed her hand along the wall, fingertips brushing over cool stone fitted in deliberate courses, unlike the rough stacking one would expect from a farmer patching together a root cellar. The precision unsettled her. Whoever built this had known their craft. Mark followed reluctantly, his footsteps heavier, each one a protest against being there. "This isn't a foundation," he said finally, his voice hushed as though speaking louder might wake something. "Farmhouses don't sit on this. They sit on dirt, on crude walls. This is different." Claire stopped with a corridor bent sharply to the left. The lantern revealed a wall built not of mismatched blocks, but long bricks. Carefully mortared, their surfaces darkened with time. She raised the lantern higher and saw that the bricks continued beyond the bend, forming a narrow passageway that stretched into shadow. It was too narrow for carts, too refined for storage. The craftsmanship suggested purpose, something meant to endure. Mark ran a hand across one of the bricks and cursed under his breath. "These aren't farm work. This is older, much older. Or else someone put more money into hiding this than they did into building the house above." Claire leaned closer, her breath clouding faintly in the chilled air. She noticed subtle marks carved into the mortar lines, faint scratches like the ones she had traced in the barn. They were spaced evenly, symbols half erased by damp, but still visible if one looked carefully. "It matches," she said quietly. "The barn, the foundation, and now here. It's all the same hand." The draft that had carried them this far pushed harder now, funneled through the narrow passage. It smelled faintly of earth and iron, metallic and raw, like the breath of something ancient. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, though she could see no source. Claire stepped closer to the passage, lantern lifted, eyes locked on the way the bricks disappeared into the dark. Mark pulled at her arm. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't ours to uncover. You don't change something, brick it over, and forget it unless there's a reason. And it's never a good one." She pulled free, steady in her resolve. "Maybe it isn't about good or bad. Maybe it's about truth. This house has been waiting. You felt that air. You saw these stones. It's not just a ruin. It's a story buried under our feet." For a long moment, Mark stared at the passage as though it might swallow them whole. The sound of the storm above had faded to a muffled hush, leaving only the hollow breath of the tunnel to fill the silence. At last he muttered, almost to himself, "Deeper than it should go. Much deeper." Claire stepped forward, her lantern's glow stretching across the first few feet of brick. Beyond it was only darkness. Yet she felt as though it were watching her, waiting for her to take that next step. And she knew she would. The brick passage swallowed them as they pressed forward, its narrowness forcing Claire to hold the lantern close. The light threw long, trembling shadows against the walls, revealing more than just stone. At first it seemed like simple wear, but as her eyes adjusted she saw the truth. The walls were marked, carved by hands that had come before. The bricks bore shallow etchings, some faint with time, others sharp as though cut only yesterday. Claire slowed, her fingers brushing against the nearest mark. It was a set of initials, plain and deliberate, JT, followed by a year she could just make out, 1927. The numbers were scratched with hesitation, the lines uneven, but they were clear. She moved further, lantern raised, and found more. A second set, different hand, different year, 1931. The deeper she looked, the more she saw. Dozens of names, some full, others only letters, each pair with dates spanning decades. Mark trailed behind her, his voice carrying unease. People were down here, a lot of them. He reached out to touch one of the carvings, his finger tracing a line. What were they doing? Why write their names here? Claire tilted the lantern, the glow falling on a section farther along. These markings were different, not simple names, but strange messages. A phrase stood out, etched with force into the brick. They listened below. The letters were jagged, carved deep enough to crack the mortar. Next to it, another hand had written, "Don't trust the walls." Her breath caught. She stepped closer, running her hand over the rough surface. More fragments appeared as she moved along. Wait for the signal. Only at night. Follow the cross. Each phrase seemed heavier than the last, their meanings unclear but carrying an urgency that unsettled her. Mark shook his head. It's graffiti. People hiding down here during Prohibition, maybe smugglers or bootleggers. They left marks to scare off anyone else. He said it with certainty, but his voice betrayed doubt. Claire stopped in front of another carving. This one was different, carefully etched, almost delicate. It was not words but a symbol, a circle with 3 lines radiating outward, identical to marks she had seen in the barn. Beneath it, faint but legible, was another date, 1894. Her hand hovered over it, her skin prickling with the weight of time. "This is older than Prohibition," she whispered. The corridor stretched on, the walls carrying layer upon layer human presence, each inscription adding to the weight pressing in on them. Some were desperate, words gouged into stone with shaking hands. Others were calm, almost ritualistic, repeating symbols that echoed across decades. It was not random. There was order here, a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Mark finally stopped walking, refusing to go further. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "Names, dates, riddles, it doesn't matter. Whoever they were, they're long gone, and we don't need to follow them. You're looking for meaning where there's none." But Claire could not pull away. She stared at the wall, at the strange, haunting messages left by people who once stood exactly where she did, carving words into stone, so they would not be forgotten. She felt as though their voices were still here, whispering in the cold draft, urging her to go deeper, to uncover the truth the house had guarded for more than a lifetime. The corridor narrowed the farther they went, the ceiling pressing lower until Mark had to stoop to keep from scraping his head against the stone. Claire kept the lantern raised, though its glow seemed to shrink with each step, as if the darkness here were thicker, hungrier. The carved names and cryptic warnings faded behind them, until only rough stone remained, damp and cold beneath her fingertips. The air shifted too, less a draft now and more a steady pull, as though something beyond the passage breathed in slow rhythm. They turned a final corner and stopped. The tunnel ended not in more wall, but in something unexpected. A door set into the earth itself. Iron, thick and scarred, its surface streaked with rust. Soil had crept down from the ceiling, half burying it, so that only the upper half was visible, the bottom edges hidden beneath packed dirt. Its hinges were enormous, blackened with age, and a heavy ring of iron hung at the center like a handle. Though no lock was visible, Claire lifted the lantern higher, her breath shallow. The light revealed scratches across the door's surface, the same kind of desperate markings they had passed in the corridor. Initials, short messages too faint to read, and symbols etched over symbols until the metal was a palimpsest of intent. She traced one carefully with her fingertip, feeling where it had been gouged into the iron. Mark let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like fear. Of course, a door in the ground, because why wouldn't there be? He shook his head, backing a step away. "This is where it ends. Claire, this isn't just history anymore. It's madness." But Claire could not turn away. The sight of it rooted her to the spot, not with dread but with a pull she couldn't explain. The map in the attic, the chained trapdoor, the flowing water in the cellar walls. All of it had led here. She knelt at the base of the door, brushing away the loose soil with her hand. The iron edge disappeared smoothly into the earth, too deep to uncover without tools. Whoever had tried before her had stopped midway, leaving claw marks in the dirt as though their strength had run out. The lantern's flame fluttered, casting the door in shifting light. For a moment she thought she saw it move, a subtle shift like breath, but when she blinked it was still again, silent and sealed. The air pressing against her face was colder here, carrying a metallic tang that clung to her tongue. Mark stood rigid behind her, his voice low. "Don't touch it again. Whatever's behind that door wasn't meant for us. People built walls and chains to keep it hidden. Do you really think we're the first to try? Look at the marks. Others were here, and they didn't open it." Claire rested her hand on the iron ring anyway. It was colder than the air, its chill biting into her skin. She did not pull, not yet, but the thought of doing so consumed her. She felt as though the house itself had been guiding her step by step to this place, to this forgotten door buried in the earth. And now that she had found it, she knew turning back would be impossible. Claire kept her hand on the iron ring a moment longer, the chill seeping into her bones, before she finally pulled back. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of water, seeping somewhere unseen. Mark's footsteps scraped against the stone as he shifted, his breathing uneven. He wouldn't come closer, not even with the lantern light reaching the edge of his boots. His face was pale, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the door as though it might suddenly open on its own. "No more," he said, his voice sharp and final. "We've gone far enough. Too far. Whatever's behind that thing should stay there." Claire turned toward him, lantern raised, her expression caught between resolve and frustration. "You felt it, didn't you? The air, the markings, the door itself. It's part of this house. We can't ignore it." Mark shook his head violently, backing away until his shoulders pressed against the cold wall. "You keep saying we, as if I wanted any of this. I didn't want this house. I didn't want these tunnels. And I sure as hell don't want to open doors buried under the ground. You're chasing shadows, Claire. And one day, those shadows are going to swallow you." His words echoed in the narrow corridor, carrying a tremor of real fear. Claire hesitated, the lantern trembling slightly in her grip. For a moment she thought she saw movement across the surface of the door, a shimmer of damp, but when she blinked it was gone. Still, the feeling that something weighted lingered in her chest. Mark turned abruptly, starting back toward the stairs. His voice carried over his shoulder. "I'm not staying down here another second. If you want to waste your life on this, fine, but leave me out of it." Reluctantly, Claire followed, though each step away from the door felt like betrayal. They climbed the worn stairs, the air growing warmer as the earth released them back into the cellar. The trapdoor groaned shut above them, chains scattered uselessly across the floorboards. By the time they returned to the living room, Mark's anger had boiled over. He paced back and forth, his hands cutting the air as he spoke. "This is madness, Claire. You risk breaking your neck on rotten steps. You dig through dirt like some obsessed archaeologist. And for what? A door that's been sealed for decades, maybe longer? Do you even hear yourself?" Claire set the lantern on the table, her voice calm but unyielding. "You keep calling it madness, but every step we take proves there's more here than a broken roof and old paint. Those carvings, the map, the water draining into walls, they're pieces of something. That door isn't just shut. It's waiting." Mark stopped, his fists clenching at his sides. "And what if it's waiting to kill us? Did that thought ever cross your mind? People don't chain things and bury them in stone unless they're dangerous." Their words clashed in the dim room, anger meeting determination. Silence stretched thin between each exchange. Mark finally sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Claire stood rigid, staring at the dartboards beneath her feet, knowing the argument had not ended. It had only been postponed, like the unopened door waiting patiently in the earth below. The tension between Claire and Mark lingered like a storm that had not fully broken. Days passed with silence stretching across the rooms, each of them retreating into separate corners of the farmhouse. Mark busied himself with small repairs he resented, hammering nails with too much force, muttering under his breath about wasted effort. Claire kept her focus on the map and the memory of the iron door, the feeling of the cold draft rising from below. She knew she needed someone outside their quarrel, someone who could see the house with different eyes. That was how she found herself driving into town to meet Dr. Lydia Green, a historian whose name had come up in a cautious whisper at the hardware store. Dr. Green arrived 2 days later, stepping from her car with a notebook tucked under her arm and a curiosity that lit her face. She was a woman in her 50s, her hair streaked with gray, her glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose as she studied the farmhouse with sharp attention. "You weren't exaggerating," she said softly, looking at the sagging roof and the peeling paint. "Places like this often hold more story than beauty." Mark stood on the porch with his arms crossed, skeptical from the start. "Another one to tell us how special the rod is," he muttered. But Claire ignored him, leading Dr. Green inside. The historian moved through the room slowly, taking notes, her gaze catching on details Claire had overlooked. The alignment of beams, the irregular cuts of the stone foundation, the age of the floorboards compared to the rest of the structure. When Claire finally lifted the trapdoor to show her the cellar, Dr. Green's calm expression shifted into intrigue. She crouched by the stairs, running her fingers along the stone, tracing the mortar lines. "This isn't just farm work," she murmured. "This is too refined, too deliberate." Mark snorted. "That's exactly what I've been saying. Somebody with too much time dug themselves a hole. Nothing more." But when Dr. Green descended into the corridor, lantern in hand, her eyes widened. She examined the carvings, the initials, the cryptic messages etched into the walls. "These are real," she said. "These names, they're tied to this county. Families that lived here generations ago. I've seen some of these initials in old town ledgers." She touched the words gouged deeply into stone. Asterisk, they listened below asterisk, and frowned. Fear has a way of marking itself in stone, but fear is usually rooted in something tangible. Claire guided her deeper until the brick passage revealed itself. Dr. Green crouched again, brushing dirt from the lower courses, her expression sharpening. "Prohibition," she said finally. "This region was full of hidden routes. Smugglers built tunnels like this to move liquor undetected. Farms were often fronts. Cellars connected to barns, barns connected to woods. But this," she gestured toward the brick walls, "this is unusually well built. Whoever constructed it had resources and skill. It wasn't a farmer working alone." Mark leaned against the wall, unconvinced. "So what? They moved a few bottles of whiskey through here. Doesn't explain the chains or the iron door buried in dirt." Dr. Green's eyes flicked toward him, thoughtful. "Not just whiskey. Guns, money. Sometimes people. Prohibition wasn't only about liquor. It was an underground economy. And when money and power are involved, secrets grow heavier. Doors like the one you described weren't only meant to hide. They were meant to protect." Claire felt a chill that wasn't from the cold draft. The historian's words carried weight, bridging the gap between rumor and reality. For the first time, someone outside herself acknowledged the significance of what lay beneath. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his cynicism faltering. Dr. Green straightened, closing her notebook. "You've uncovered something important. But be careful. History buried this for a reason. And history rarely lets itself be unearthed without cost." The farmhouse seemed to exhale in that moment, its silence deepening as though it, too, had heard her warning. The cellar air felt heavier with 3 people moving through it, the lantern light stretching shadows into uneasy shapes. Dr. Lydia Green walked ahead, her smaller lantern lifted high, the flames steady despite the chill that licked at their faces. Claire followed close behind, clutching her own light, while Mark trailed reluctantly, muttering about wasted time. The historian's eyes gleamed with curiosity, sharp behind her glasses, as if every stone whispered to her. At the brick passage she slowed, crouching low to study the mortar. Her lantern's glow skimmed the floor, and something caught her attention. "Look here," she said, her voice calm but edged with intrigue. Claire knelt beside her, and together they saw it. The faint outline of another seam in the floor, almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and dust. Lydia brushed it with her hand, revealing a break in stone that wasn't natural. "This wasn't built as one tunnel," she explained. "There are side passages, closed over or hidden. Whoever designed this wanted more than a straight path." Mark grumbled, shifting uneasily. "Or it's just settling. Old stones crack. Doesn't mean there's some secret web under our feet." Ignoring him, Lydia stood and pressed further down the corridor. She paused at a junction where the wall jutted inward awkwardly, a section Claire had assumed was damaged. Lydia lifted her lantern, tilting it to send light across the bricks. The glow revealed shallow gaps between stones, running vertically like the outline of a sealed archway. "See that?" she asked. "This was an opening once. They bricked it up deliberately." Claire's chest tightened. She moved closer, tracing the line with her fingertip. The bricks felt smoother than the others, their mortar fresher in comparison, though still old. "Why seal it?" she asked. Lydia's expression darkened, because what lay beyond no longer served its purpose, or it served it too well. Smugglers often abandoned side tunnels when they feared discovery, but sometimes she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes tunnels were sealed to keep others from using them. The draft shifted again, stronger now, flickering the lanterns. The flames bent toward the bricked arch, as though drawn by a hidden breath behind the wall. Mark cursed under his breath, stepping back. "That's enough for me. Drafts, bricks, stories. It all adds up to danger. I'm not sticking around while you two play archaeologists." But Lydia wasn't finished. She moved further still, her lantern raised high. At another bend, the light revealed yet another anomaly, a narrow crack along the ceiling where stone had shifted. The lantern's flame pushed through, catching the faint outline of empty space beyond. She adjusted the light, and for a brief moment, the glow spilled into darkness that was not the corridor they stood in, but something else, another passage running parallel. Unseen until now. Claire gasped, her heart racing. The map had shown multiple lines, branching and intersecting beneath the house. This was proof. It wasn't a single corridor leading to the iron door. It was a network. She imagined bootleggers moving crates, whisper exchanges in the dark, hidden routes winding beneath the fields. And yet, the carvings on the walls, the warnings, spoke of more than smuggling. Lydia lowered the lantern slowly, her voice measured. This place is larger than it appears. More deliberate. You've only uncovered the surface. Mark shook his head, already turning back. Or you've uncovered the reason we should leave. Branching tunnels mean collapse, danger, death. Whatever is down here isn't worth it. Claire stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the faint cracks glowing with hidden space. The historian's lantern had revealed what the farmhouse had guarded for decades. The house wasn't sitting on a cellar. It was sitting on a maze. And Claire knew she could never walk away from it now. They moved carefully through the passage, the historian's lantern cutting arcs of gold across the brick. The air seemed colder now, the draft steady and sure, as though guiding them deeper. Claire walked close to the wall, her fingers brushing over the uneven surface, feeling for the same symbols and carvings she had traced before. It was during this search that her hand fell on something unexpected. Near the bend where the corridor narrowed, one brick gave way slightly beneath her touch. She pressed again, harder this time, and the brick shifted inward with a hollow scrape. "Wait," she whispered. Lydia turned back quickly, her lantern tilted low, illuminating the small recess that opened behind the brick. The cavity was shallow but deliberate, just large enough to hide something. Nestled inside, coated in dust but unmistakably intact, was a tin box. Its edges were smooth, its surface dull but not destroyed by rust, and the lid was sealed tight with a line of solder along the seam. Claire pulled it out carefully, brushing dirt from its surface. It was heavier than she expected. Mark groaned behind her. "Great. Another box of junk. Let me guess, more doodles and nonsense for you two to fawn over?" Lydia ignored him. She took the box from Claire, turning it in her hands with the care of someone handling evidence. "This isn't junk," she said. "Waterproof tins like this were used for records, something smugglers or bootleggers didn't want to risk losing to damp. If it's what I think it is, this could tell us exactly what went on down here." Claire's pulse quickened. She found a flat stone, placed the tin carefully on top, and with the lantern light steady, she worked at the seam with the tip of a pocket knife. The solder resisted but cracked in places, flaking off in brittle strips until finally the lid gave way with a soft pop. A rush of stale air escaped, and inside lay bundles of folded papers, bound with twine that had darkened but held firm. She lifted the top bundle out and untied it, spreading the sheets across the stone surface. Faded ink lined the pages in neat columns, names, dates, numbers, coded symbols running down the margins. Some names were familiar, the same initials carved into the tunnel walls. Others were unknown, paired with locations and tallies. Lydia leaned close, adjusting her glasses, her voice low and steady. "These are ledgers, shipments, transactions. Look here, whiskey, rye, crates marked with weights. And these symbols," she tapped at the repeating circles and triangles, "these are code marks, likely meant to tell insiders where the goods were headed." Claire's eyes scanned further down the page. Some entries had been crossed out violently, whole rows blackened in thick strokes of ink. At the bottom of one sheet, a phrase leapt out, scrawled hastily. "One shipment lost, door sealed." She read it aloud, her voice echoing against the stone. Mark shook his head, unnerved despite himself. "Sealed. You see? Even they knew better than to keep digging." But Claire couldn't let go of the words. Door sealed. The iron barrier at the tunnel's end was not just a boundary. It was part of the story these men had lived and hidden. She lifted another sheet, the names stretching back years, some carrying marks beside them like debts paid or lives lost. Lydia exhaled slowly, the weight of discovery clear in her tone. This isn't just a farmhouse cellar. This was a hub. People risked everything here. Money, freedom, maybe even their lives. And whatever they sealed behind that door was important enough to record. Claire stared at the ledger, the ink faded but unyielding. For the first time, the whispers of the past had given her more than fragments on walls. They had left her proof, and proof always demanded to be followed. The ledger still lay open on the stone when the sound began, a faint groan that echoed to the corridor like the low warning of some hidden beast. Claire froze, lantern light trembling across the walls. Lydia looked up sharply, her hand instinctively bracing against the bricks. Even Mark, who had been leaning against the wall with folded arms, stiffened at the sound. It deepened, became a grinding, then a sudden crack that split the silence in two. Dust rained down in a thin veil. The walls shuddered, small fragments breaking loose from the ceiling above. Claire clutched the lantern close, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's shifting." Mark swore, shoving himself away from the wall. "I told you this place wasn't safe." The next sound was sharper still, a snap like timber breaking. A section of the tunnel just ahead of them gave way. Bricks tumbled outward, spilling dirt and stone into the passage, the roar deafening in confined space. The lantern's light caught a cloud of dust that swelled thick, choking, swallowing them in darkness. Claire threw herself against the wall, shielding the tin box with her body. Lydia ducked low, pulling her scarf across her mouth, while Mark stumbled backward, coughing and cursing, his voice half smothered by the haze. When the sound finally settled, the silence that followed was worse. Dust hung so thick that the lantern barely cut through it, and every breath scraped raw against their throats. Claire lifted her head, her ears still ringing. The corridor ahead was gone, replaced by a mound of rubble, bricks, and earth that blocked the way entirely. Lydia pressed her palm against the wall, steadying herself. "We have to get out. Now." If one section collapsed, the rest could follow. Mark seized on her words immediately. Finally, someone with sense. "We're leaving. No arguments this time." His hands shook as he pointed toward the stairs. "Before this whole place buries us alive." But Claire's eyes lingered on the debris, through the shifting dust. She thought she saw the faint outline of another passage exposed behind the collapse, a glimpse of space that hadn't been meant for them to see. The temptation burned in her chest, but Lydia's grip on her arm pulled her back. "Don't," the historian said firmly, her voice leaving no room for debate. "Not now. Survival first, discovery second." The three of them began to retreat, each step heavy with urgency. The corridor groaned again, faint cracks whispering above as if the earth itself resented their presence. Mark kept glancing upward, his face pale, muttering prayers under his breath between coughs. Claire clutched the lantern tight, guiding them back toward the staircase, her other hand still gripping the ledger she had gathered from the tin box. When they finally reached the cellar, the air felt almost sweet despite the damp, the open space above a relief. Claire pushed the trapdoor open with shaking arms, letting light from the farmhouse spill down. They climbed out one by one, collapsing onto the floorboards as the house creaked in uneasy sympathy. Mark was the first to speak, his voice raw. "That's it. No more. I won't die chasing ghosts underground." Claire said nothing, her eyes fixed on the dust still clinging to her clothes, her ears filled with the memory of stone giving way. Somewhere beneath the ruin, behind the collapse, there had been another path. She was certain of it, and though fear still pulsed through her veins, she knew the farmhouse hadn't finished with them yet. The farmhouse felt different after the collapse, as though the dust and noise from below had shaken more than stone. For hours afterward, Mark had refused to speak. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded, staring at the wall while Claire and Lydia cleaned themselves of dirt and soot. The silence pressed thick around them, heavier than the storm that still lingered outside. Claire expected another argument, another round of his anger and scorn. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharpness she had grown used to. "You could have been killed down there," he said quietly, eyes still fixed on the wall. "We all could have." And yet his voice trailed off, his lips tightening as if the words fought to stay inside. Claire stopped wiping dust from her lantern and looked at him. And yet, what? Mark exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair. His face looked older in the dim light, lined with exhaustion but softened by something else. And yet you were right. There's more under this place than rot and broken beams. I saw it with my own eyes. The carvings, the tunnels, that door. He shook his head, finally meeting her gaze. It's not just your imagination. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had fought for weeks against his cynicism, his ridicule, his constant dismissal of her vision. Hearing the words now, spoken so plainly, left her chest tight. "You believe me?" she asked softly. "I can't not believe you," he admitted. "I wanted to. God, I wanted to. Because if I could keep pretending this was all in your head, then maybe we could just patch the roof, sell the place, and walk away. But I can't. Not after seeing that ledger. Not after standing in front of that door. You were right to keep digging." Claire set the lantern down and lowered herself into the chair opposite him. For the first time since they had signed the deed, the air between them felt less like a battlefield. She studied him, searching for the sarcasm that usually undercut his words. But there was none. His shoulders slumped, his tone weary but sincere. Lydia, who had been listening from across the room, closed her notebook quietly. "That's a good first step," she said. "Belief is the beginning. But belief won't make this place safer. We need to be cautious more than ever now." Mark gave a short laugh, dry but without mockery. "Cautious. That's the one thing we haven't been since we set foot here." He rubbed his face with both hands, then looked back at Claire. "I don't like it. I still think we're risking more than we can handle. But I won't fight you on it anymore. If you say we keep going, then we keep going. Together." The words struck her deeper than she expected. For so long, she had carried the weight of her conviction alone, against the scorn and the town's whispers. Now, at last, she felt that weight shift, shared if only slightly. She nodded, her eyes steady on his. "Then we move forward, carefully, but we don't turn back." Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his frame, but he didn't argue. Outside, the storm began to ease, the patter of rain softening against the roof. For the first time, the farmhouse felt less like a place of derision and more like the beginning of something they faced together. The chains had been broken, the tunnels revealed, and now even Mark could no longer deny the truth hidden beneath their feet. The air in the tunnel still carried the sting of dust from the collapse, but Claire refused to let it end there. With Lydia's lantern held high and Mark walking closer now than he ever had before, they returned cautiously, testing each step, listening for the groan of stone. The rubble from the fallen section still blocked their path ahead, but it was as Claire examined the walls near the collapse that she noticed something odd. One section of brick was smoother than the rest, its mortar sharper, almost too perfect compared to the aged, crumbling lines around it. She brushed the surface with her hand and felt the faint echo of hollowness beneath. "Here," she whispered, her voice echoing slightly. Lydia stepped closer, studying the wall with practiced eyes. "You're right. This isn't load-bearing. It's a facade. Someone sealed something behind it." Mark's expression tightened. "Another sealed wall. Haven't we learned anything? If they bricked it off, they wanted it hidden." But this time he didn't step back. He stayed close as Claire fetched a rusted crowbar they had found among the farmhouse tools. Together, with Lydia steadying the lantern, she worked the iron into the seam. The mortar cracked reluctantly, sending thin lines of dust into the air. Mark, after a moment's hesitation, took the crowbar from her and added his weight. With a sharp snap, a brick gave way, clattering onto the ground. Soon another followed, and another, until a hole large enough to peer through opened in the wall. The lantern light pierced the darkness beyond, revealing not another passage but a room. Its air spilled out cool and dry, carrying the stale scent of age but not decay. Claire pushed more bricks free until the opening was wide enough, then crawled through first, lantern leading. The space was larger than she expected, the walls lined with shelves that had sagged but not collapsed. Wooden crates stacked neatly in rows filled the corners, their stenciled markings still visible beneath a layer of dust. Glass bottles glimmered faintly where straw padding had crumbled away. Lydia followed, her breath catching. "It's a cache," she whispered. "Untouched. A century at least." Claire moved carefully to one crate, prying it open with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in burlap, were bottles of amber liquid, their corks sealed tight with wax. The labels, though faded, still bore names of distilleries long shuttered. She lifted one, marveling at its weight, at the way the glass caught the lantern's glow. Mark joined them reluctantly, his eyes scanning the room. For once he said nothing mocking. Instead, he crouched by a smaller chest set apart from the rest. He brushed away the dust and forced it open, revealing ledgers, envelopes, and small sacks of coin, their surfaces tarnished but intact. He whistled low under his breath, not in ridicule, but in awe. This is worth something. More than something. Lydia adjusted her glasses, her eyes shining. This is history frozen in place. They bricked it off, and no one ever came back. You found preserved room, contraband, records, everything. It's priceless. Claire stood in the center of the chamber, lantern lifted high, the shadows of crates and bottles stretching around her. For the first time since she had signed the deed, she felt vindication not just in her heart, but in her hands. The farmhouse had yielded proof, tangible and undeniable, that it had always held more than ruin. Behind the false wall, in the silence of a room untouched for a century, the house had spoken its truth. The lantern's glow spilled deeper into the hidden room, brushing across stacks of crates that seemed frozen in time. Dust lay thick on their surfaces, but the stencils painted across the wood were still legible in places. Brand names of distilleries outlawed a century ago, destinations scrawled in block letters, numbers that tallied shipments meant to pass unseen. Claire pried open another crate, her hands shaking as the nails squealed free. Inside, glass bottles rested in straw padding, their corks sealed with wax that had dried to a brittle sheen. The liquid inside shimmered gold in the light, preserved as if waiting for a toast that never came. Lydia leaned closer, all softening her voice. This is authentic. Rye, bourbon, Canadian imports. They smuggled everything they could move. Whoever ran this operation wasn't a small-time bootlegger. This was organized. Claire nodded, but her attention was pulled to the far shelves where other objects rested. She moved toward them, brushing aside cobwebs to reveal bundles wrapped in cloth. When she unrolled one, she found a revolver, its barrel dull with age but unmistakable. Another cloth revealed a shotgun, its stock carefully polished even after years in hiding. More weapons followed, pistols, cartridges, boxes of ammunition. The sight chilled her. These were not just tools for protection. They were meant for defense, for confrontation. Mark crouched beside a crate and forced the lid open. Instead of bottles, it held stacks of personal effects. Coats folded neatly, hats, even a child's small pair of shoes. He lifted them slowly, his brow furrowed. They lived down here, he murmured. Or at least, they stayed here long enough to leave their lives behind. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, the initials YAR stamped into its corner. Inside were faded photographs of family, their faces blurred by time, but their eyes still piercing. Claire moved to another shelf where small ledgers had been stacked, their covers brittle but intact. She opened one carefully, the ink faded but legible. Names filled the pages, alongside amounts, dates, and locations. Some entries bore simple notations like delivered or safe. Others carried darker words, missing, lost, sealed. She traced one entry from 1926, her stomach tightening as she read. Final shipment through East Tunnel, door closed. The words echoed what she had seen in the earlier ledger, confirming that the iron door was not just symbolic. It was part of the story that ended here. Lydia examined a cluster of envelopes tucked in a corner, sealed but never sent. The addresses were scrawled in hurried handwriting, most bearing names tied to towns along the river. She held one to the lantern and read the faded ink. They were communicating with people across the state. This was part of a network. And the way it's all been left, it wasn't abandoned by choice. The weight of the room settled over them. The bottles were valuable, the weapons dangerous, but the personal belongings gave the chamber a haunting presence. These weren't faceless smugglers. They had families, lives, fears. And something had forced them to leave everything behind, sealing it away as if time itself could not be trusted. Mark placed the small shoes back in the crate, his usual sarcasm gone. This isn't just about money or history. Something happened here. Something bad enough to make them bury it all. Claire held the lantern higher, her gaze falling on the walls of the chamber. More symbols were etched there, faint but deliberate, repeating the same circles and triangles that had followed them from the barn to the corridor. In the cold silence of the hidden room, the farmhouse's shadows stretched back a century, carrying with it the weight of prohibition and the unspoken cost of secrets. The chamber had already yielded bottles, weapons, and ledgers, each discovery layering the air with more questions than answers. Claire stood near the back wall, lantern raised, when her eyes caught a small metal box wedged between two crates. It was slimmer than the waterproof tin they had found earlier, its lid dented, the lock long since broken. She pulled it free, brushing away the thick dust, and set it carefully on a shelf. Mark, crouched nearby, leaned forward as she pried it open. Inside were papers folded into neat stacks, their edges yellow but surprisingly well-preserved. Lydia stepped close, her curiosity sharpening. "Letters," she said softly. "Personal ones." Claire unfolded the first sheet with delicate fingers. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. She began to read aloud, her voice catching on the words. "Asterisk to my brother, Samuel. The work continues beneath Miller's Road. We moved the last shipment through the East Passage. The crates remain sealed as agreed until the next call." Asterisk, she paused, her eyes scanning lower until the signature stopped her cold. Edward R. Wickham. Her breath stilled. The name pressed against her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. Wickham, her own family name before her grandmother married. She whispered aloud, and Mark's head snapped up. "Wickham," he asked, his voice rough. "That's your mother's side, isn't it?" Claire nodded slowly, her hand trembling as she lowered the letter. "Edward Wickham. That was my great-grandfather's name." The silence in the chamber thickened. Lydia leaned in, adjusting her glasses to study the letter more closely. "It fits," she murmured. "These documents are from the 1920s. If this was your great-grandfather, he wasn't just connected. He was a participant. He helped build this network." Claire's mind spun as she unfolded more of the letters. Each was addressed to family members or associates, speaking in half-coded language about shipments, routes, and dangers. Some mentioned names she recognized from childhood stories. Uncles, cousins whose histories had been nothing more than fragments in family lore. She remembered tales her grandmother used to tell, vague references to hard times and men who worked in the dark. She had always assumed they were just exaggerations of farm life. Now the truth lay in her hands, written in her ancestors' own words. Mark sat back against a crate, stunned into silence. Finally, he muttered, "So this is why you felt drawn here. It wasn't just a dream. It was blood. You brought us to your family's secrets without even knowing it." Claire clutched the letter tighter, her throat dry. The words blurred for a moment as tears welled in her eyes, though she fought them back. "He never spoke of this. My grandmother never did either. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they chose to bury it, the same way these tunnels were buried." Lydia placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Families pass down more than they realize. Sometimes it's land, sometimes it's silence. But silence can be heavier than anything else." Claire folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the box with reverence. She felt the farmhouse pressing around her, its weight no longer that of strangers, but her own history rising from the shadows. The tunnels, the symbols, the sealed door, they were no longer mysteries belonging to others. They were her inheritance, waiting for her to decide whether to carry it forward or finally lay it to rest. Claire had barely set the letter back into the tin when a chill ran down her spine, drawing her eyes to the far corner of the chamber. There, partly obscured by crates and debris, was a narrow passageway she hadn't noticed before. Its opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, the edges smoothed as if worn by countless hands over the decades. A faint draft rose from the darkness, carrying the scent of damp earth and moss, and it seemed to beckon her forward. She glanced at Lydia, who adjusted her lantern and gave a slight nod, recognizing the significance without words. Mark hesitated at the entrance, his arms crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're kidding, right? Another tunnel?" he muttered. "This is insane. We already nearly got buried yesterday." Claire ignored him. "This one's different. Look at the angle. It leads outward. The foundation slopes. I think it goes beyond the house." Lydia crouched low to inspect the floor. Judging by the wear, this wasn't storage. Someone moved quickly through here, running probably. The three of them squeezed into the passage one at a time. The walls were tight, forcing Claire to hold the lantern high, the light flickering across rough stone. The air was cooler here, fresher, and carried a faint earthy smell that suggested it opened somewhere above ground. As they moved, the ground sloped gradually downward, the tunnel curving in gentle arcs that hinted at careful planning. The bricks and stones were worn smooth in the center, forming a natural track from repeated passage, while the edges remained rough, untouched. Mark muttered complaints the entire way, shuffling along reluctantly. "This is ridiculous. Who would even think to build a tunnel out here? And for what? It's just a forest, not a city." Claire kept moving, her eyes scanning the walls. Small markings appeared here and there. Scratches, initials, symbols similar to those she had seen in the barn and the corridor beneath the house. They seemed to mark the path, a guide for those who knew where it led. She traced one with her finger, feeling the groove, imagining the hands that had pressed it there, the fear and urgency of whoever had moved through this tunnel decades ago. The light ahead began to change as the passage rose slightly, narrow slits of daylight, piercing through cracks in the soil above. Claire's heart quickened. She could feel the tunnel's purpose in every brick, every worn stone. It had been an escape route, not for valuables or cargo, but for people. The dry, shallow markings on the walls were like signposts, directing anyone in haste toward safety. Mark finally stopped, breathing hard, and looked at her. "Okay, I'll admit it," he said reluctantly. "If anyone needed to get out fast, this would do it. I can see why you think it matters now." Claire's lips curved slightly, but she didn't slow her pace. The daylight grew stronger as they continued, filtered through the cracks above, until the tunnel opened at last into a hidden clearing at the edge of the woods. Moss-covered stones formed a rough outline of a small, concealed entrance. Claire stepped forward, the lantern illuminating the roots and fallen leaves, her gaze tracing the path the tunnel had once carved from the house to the forest. Lydia knelt, brushing dirt from the entrance. "They could have disappeared entirely if needed," she said. "This was meant for emergencies. Fast exit. Concealed. Nobody outside the family would have ever guessed." Claire looked back toward the farmhouse, half hidden by trees, and felt a strange weight lift from her chest. The house had been more than a ruin, more than her dream. It had been a fortress, a refuge, a network of secret passageways. And now she understood why it had drawn her in. The past had left its story for her to uncover, and she had followed it all the way to the hidden escape. The morning sun barely pierced the gray clouds as a rumble of vehicles approached along the gravel drive. Claire had been organizing supplies in the barn, brushing dust off crates and inspecting the boards for rot, when the sound of engines and gravel shifting under tires drew her gaze toward the farmhouse gates. A convoy of black SUVs and pickup trucks rolled into the yard, dust rising in their wake. She felt a tightness in her chest as she recognized the unmistakable sheen of polished chrome, the uniformity of tinted windows, a developer's entourage. Mark, already standing at the porch, squinted at the vehicles with a mixture of irritation and unease. "I told you this house would attract attention," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "They've been waiting for someone to mess with it, and now you've done it." Claire followed his gaze as three men in crisp suits stepped out of the lead SUV, clipboards in hand, papers fluttering from a breeze. Their polished shoes sank slightly into the gravel, and one of them, taller than the rest, called out in a tone that tried to sound casual but carried the weight of authority. "Morning. We're interested in the property," he said. His gaze swept the farmhouse, the barn, and the surrounding fields, lingering in a way that made Claire bristle. "We understand the history of the land, but we think it will be better in our hands. We can make a very fair offer." Mark's laugh was short and brittle. "Fair? You mean cheap. You think you can waltz in and buy 100 years of this family's life for pennies." The lead developer's smile didn't falter. "We're offering a practical price," he said. "The repairs alone will cost far more than you've imagined, and the potential for development is enormous. We can make it worth your while to walk away." Claire stepped forward, the weight of their presence settling over her. She felt the pull of the farmhouse behind her, the history buried beneath its floors and walls, and she knew she couldn't let it go so easily. "You don't understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just land. It's a house that's been part of this community for generations, and it has secrets that can't be measured in money." The developer glanced at her, expression flickering between amusement and patience. "Secrets don't pay taxes," he said smoothly, "and they certainly don't restore a roof or stabilize a foundation. We're offering you a chance to walk away before it's too late." Mark shifted uncomfortably beside her, muttering under his breath, "They're right. We could use the money." Claire turned to him sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Not this time, Mark. Not for this." She faced the developers again. "You can make any offer you want, but this house isn't for sale. Not until we understand it fully, not until we know what's hidden here. You're not taking it from us." The taller man smile tightened slightly. He glanced at his colleagues, then back at her, his tone measured. "You're making an emotional decision. It could cost you more than you realize." Claire's fingers brushed the edge of the ledger tucked under her arm. The tunnels, the crates, the hidden escape. They weren't just artifacts. They were proof of a history that demanded respect. She squared her shoulders, the farmhouse looming behind her like a guardian. "We'll take our risks," she said, "because some things aren't measured in money." For a long moment, the developers exchanged looks, their confidence faltering under her unwavering gaze. Mark shifted again, silent this time, as if recognizing that her conviction had changed the rules of the argument. The air in the yard seemed to hold its breath, the hum of engines fading as the standoff settled, and Claire knew, for the first time, that no offer, no authority, could pull her from the house they were only just beginning to understand. The day after the confrontation, the farmhouse seemed to breathe with a quiet intensity, as though aware that the stakes had grown higher. Claire, Mark, and Dr. Lydia Green sat at the kitchen table, the ledger and letters laid out before them, while sunlight slanted through the cracked windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Lydia had already begun photographing the artifacts, carefully noting each crate, each letter, each etched symbol in the corridor and barn. Claire watched her work, feeling a mixture of awe and relief. Finally, they had proof that the farmhouse was more than rusted wood and broken beams. It was history. Mark, still uneasy, leaned back in his chair, watching Lydia as she adjusted her camera. "So what now?" he asked. "We show them these papers, and they just, what? Leave us alone." Lydia looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Not just leave you alone. This evidence establishes the farmhouse as a protected site under state preservation laws. Once authorities see these records and corroborate the history of smuggling and hidden networks, the property cannot legally be altered or destroyed without proper review. Any attempt by developers to claim it or demolish it would be halted immediately." Claire's eyes widened. "So they can't force us to sell?" Lydia shook her head. "Not without a legal battle, and you have the weight of history on your side. You're not just offending a building. You're defending a piece of cultural heritage. These letters, the ledger, the hidden escape, even the symbols etched in the walls, they establish significance beyond monetary value." Mark ran a hand through his hair, still skeptical but listening. "I don't know if I trust anyone to care that much about old bottles and letters. What if they just push us aside anyway?" Lydia smiled faintly. "That's why documentation is key. We recorded everything, photographed everything, cataloged the artifacts. The authorities take this seriously. You found proof that people lived and worked here, that the tunnels were used for more than simple storage, that the iron door and the chamber beneath weren't just anomalies. That's the legal foundation for preservation." Claire exhaled, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders slightly. "It feels like the house is finally on our side," she said softly, tracing her finger along the edge of the ledger. "Like it wanted someone to see what was here before it's too late." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, all those warnings, the chains, the collapse, it wasn't just danger for danger's sake. The house was protecting itself, and maybe us, until we were ready to understand it. Lydia nodded. Exactly. Preservation laws exist for this reason. Structures like this, tunnels like the ones beneath your farmhouse, aren't just architecture. They're stories. Evidence of human ingenuity, risk, and history. By documenting everything and presenting it properly, you've created an unassailable claim. Any developer who tries to override that will have to contend with legal precedent and public interest. Claire looked out the window at the farmhouse, the afternoon sun catching the broken shingles and weathered siding. She felt a deep sense of validation, not just for her decision to buy the house, but for every choice she had made in the weeks since. The ridicule, the arguments, the near collapse of the tunnels, all of it had led to this moment. Mark reached over and placed a hand on her arm. I still don't like every second of it, he admitted, but you were right. We're not losing this place, and we won't be forced to sell. Not now, not ever. Claire nodded, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since stepping foot on the property, the farmhouse felt like more than a ruin. It was a protected piece of history, shielded by law and human understanding alike. The past was no longer hidden. It had been acknowledged, defended, and preserved, and they were its guardians. The town hall was quieter than Claire expected, the air thick with anticipation, and the faint scent of polished wood and damp coats. Rows of folding chairs had been set up for neighbors, local officials, and a few journalists Lydia had convinced to attend. Claire stood near the front, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium she had insisted they use to display the ledger, letters, and photographs of the hidden tunnels. The artifacts caught the afternoon light, streaming through tall windows, casting faint reflections on the walls. Claire's stomach fluttered, not from nerves, but from a knowledge that finally, the truth would be laid bare. Mark stood beside her, stiff and uneasy. He had spent the morning pacing the farmhouse, muttering under his breath about the humiliation of speaking publicly. But he had agreed. He had agreed because the farmhouse, the tunnels, and the chambers beneath them were undeniable now. And so was his role in undermining Claire from the very beginning. When the room had settled, Lydia spoke first, her tone calm and authoritative. She introduced the history of the farmhouse, the tunnels, the hidden chambers, and the significance of the artifacts. She outlined the ledgers, the letters, the iron door, and the carefully bricked passages, emphasizing the farmhouse's connection to Prohibition-era smuggling networks and the extraordinary preservation of the site. The audience listened, a mixture of astonishment, curiosity, and disbelief etched across their faces. Then it was Mark's turn. He swallowed hard and stepped forward, his voice low at first, cracking slightly as he addressed the crowd. "I have something I need to admit," he said, his eyes sweeping over the neighbors who had laughed when Claire first bought the farmhouse, the local officials who had been skeptical of the property's value, and the journalists scribbling notes in small leather notebooks. For months, I mocked my wife. I called her vision foolish. I laughed at the idea of this place having any worth beyond rusted wood and broken boards. I told friends, family, and even strangers that she had made a mistake. He paused, the weight of his confession settling across the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably, and Claire felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with anticipation. Mark continued, his voice gaining steadiness as he went on. "I was wrong. I see that now. This farmhouse, it is more than a house. It holds history, ingenuity, and secrets that I couldn't have imagined. The tunnels, the chambers, the letters, and the ledgers, they prove my wife's vision was not only right, it was extraordinary." Claire felt a wave of emotion sweep through her, subtle but undeniable. She watched the hardened lines of Mark's face soften as he admitted what had long needed acknowledgement. "I was too blind to see it before. I am sorry. To my wife, to this town, and anyone I encourage to doubt the importance of this place." Claire was right to follow her instincts, to keep digging, and to uncover the truth beneath our feet. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then a neighbor, an elderly man who had once scoffed at the farmhouse, stood and nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his eyes. A few others murmured in agreement, some clapping softly, while the officials exchanged glances, their expressions conveying recognition of both the farmhouse's historical value and Mark's sincerity. Claire stepped forward and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. He looked down at her and gave a small, rueful smile. The public apology, long overdue, had not only acknowledged her vision, but also begun to mend the fractures caused by years of disbelief and ridicule. Outside, the wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse, carrying the faintest echo of approval, as if the land itself had witnessed the truth finally recognized. Mark straightened, voice firmer now. This house belongs to its history, to my wife's courage, and all who respect what it represents. I was wrong, and I will make sure that never forgets it again. The hall, once heavy with skepticism, now held quiet reverence. Claire felt a swell of vindication and relief. The farmhouse, the tunnels, and everything beneath them were no longer just hers. They belonged to story acknowledged, defended, and shared. Months had passed since the public apology, and the farmhouse had begun to take on a new rhythm. Where there had once been tension, dust, and the echo of arguments, there was now purposeful activity. Claire moved through the rooms with quiet authority. The barn slowly restored, windows cleared, and floors reinforced. Mark followed in a different way. Not with sarcasm, but with the careful attention of someone who had finally understood the stakes. Together they had mapped the tunnels, cataloged the chambers, and secured the iron door, leaving the delicate artifacts in protective cases, while preserving the architecture of the hidden passages beneath their home. Visitors came now quietly, with permission, curious neighbors and historians alike, drawn to the farmhouse not as a ruin, but as a repository of stories long forgotten. Claire had insisted that the site remain both home and museum. The living spaces above had been restored for comfort, warmth, light, and practicality, while below, the tunnels had been stabilized with lanterns and low barriers to allow careful exploration. The brick passages, once a secret carved in stone and shadow, were now marked with explanatory signs and maps, connecting them to the artifacts they had uncovered. Ledgers, letters, bottles, and tools of the smuggling trade. Mark walked the corridors beneath the house more easily than he had the first time, lantern in hand, his earlier fear replaced by cautious reverence. He had come to understand that these walls, these stone floors, carried stories not only of crime and secrecy, but of ingenuity, survival, and the human need to protect what matters. The symbols etched into the bricks, once inscrutable warnings, had become teaching tools, pointing to the lengths people had gone to preserve their lives and livelihoods during Prohibition. He watched visitors trace their fingers over replicas, read translations of the coded entries, and paused at the chambers where crates of bottles had once been hidden. Claire often lingered at the entrance to the hidden escape, watching as people imagined the urgency of those who had once moved silently through these passages. Children tiptoed along the edges, wide-eyed, while adults studied every detail with quiet fascination. She felt the pull of the farmhouse in a way she hadn't before, a mixture of responsibility and pride. This was no longer just her vision. It had become a bridge between eras, a way for the past to speak through stone, wood, and iron. The farmhouse itself seemed to respond to the change. Doors no longer groaned with resentment. Floorboards held firm beneath careful steps, and even the one-stamped cellar retained a chill that was welcoming rather than ominous. Every corner held a story. The barn where initials had been carved, the false wall behind which crates and weapons had rested, the iron door sealing forgotten escape. Visitors saw the farmhouse as a museum, but for Claire and Mark, it remained a home, infused with daily life, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of routine. Mark had begun to speak of the house differently, telling friends and neighbors not only of its restoration, but of the lessons it held. "It's not just history, you see," he would say. "It's proof that sometimes patience, curiosity, and courage can uncover truths buried for decades. My wife never gave up, and the house rewarded her." Claire walked the tunnel one evening, lantern in hand, following the air currents that once guided smugglers' footsteps. She paused at the chambers, letting the silence settle around her. In that stillness, she felt the weight of generations, the people who had built the tunnels, the families who had hidden within them, and the legacies she had inherited. The farmhouse, now alive with visitors and daily life above, remained quiet and steadfast below, preserving every secret and story. It was home, it was history, and through her care, it would remain both for years to come. The tunnel had outlived its builders, outlasted secrecy and fear, and now, under Claire's stewardship, it found its permanent voice.